By the 1970s, the horror movie world found itself swept by the slasher genre, movies typically involving a killer, usually masked, who stalks and kills characters one after another, popularized by such horror masterpieces as 1974's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Black Christmas, as well as the iconic 1978 Halloween, which cemented the slasher movie formula into a whole subgenre of horror cinema. One slasher movie from this period, though largely forgotten and more of a psychological horror film, remains one of the most disturbing yet complex horror movies ever made, dealing with heavy topics not usually found in many movies of this type. Alice, Sweet Alice from 1976. Set in the industrialized urban sprawl of the city of Paterson, New Jersey in 1961, the movie begins in a room inside a church, innocently enough, where we are introduced to the three most important characters in the film: Catherine Spages, a divorced mother, and her two young daughters, 9-year-old Karen and 12-year-old Alice. It quickly becomes apparent that of the two, Karen seems to be the favorite, given the way both her mother and the church's priest, Father Tom, treat her, with Father Tom even gifting her his mother's very own cross as a gift ahead of Karen's first communion. The attention and affection that Karen gets visibly has an effect on Alice, who looks on in shame and jealousy, confused as to why she never gets the same affection that her younger sister Karen does. Feeling alienated and down, Alice wanders off into the church while wearing a creepy translucent mask until she accidentally frightens Miss Tredoni, Father Tom's housekeeper. Scolded and attacked by her mother for doing so, and boiling with jealousy after seeing Karen receive her gift, Alice steals Karen's favorite porcelain baby doll and hides it in an abandoned building, causing Karen to be lured to the building, only for Alice to scare her by revealing a second mask she hid under her signature translucent one. Alice then quickly locks Karen in the abandoned building out of frustration, before quickly opening the door to free her, warning her that if she tells anyone about what just happened, she will never see her beloved doll ever again. With tensions between the two sisters reaching a boiling point, the day of Karen's first communion arrives, but before Karen could walk in front of the church's attendees, she is choked to death and then set on fire. Meanwhile, Alice arrives late to the communion, but just as she was about to receive the Eucharist, Karen's badly burnt and charred body is discovered, disrupting the entire service and throwing it into a tragic frenzy. Shocked and heartbroken, Catherine and the whole community at large search for answers when suspicions begin to emerge involving Alice. Taking into account the innate envy and jealousy of everyone from Alice's aunt to her landlord, the unnerving Mr. Alfonso, adopts a sneaking suspicion that Alice could be behind the killing, also taking into account that she arrived late to the communion. At the same time, detectives are assigned to work the case, searching for any leads regarding the murder. Yet the more they investigate, the more convinced they are that Alice is the killer. Crushed by the news, Catherine's ex-husband then comes to town, who launches an investigation of his own into his daughter's death, determined to find answers out of a mistrust of the authorities, even growing angry at them for suspecting Alice's involvement. However, even after Alice is taken away to a mental institute after evaluations paint a dark picture of her sanity, bizarre murders linked to Catherine and her family continue to take place, raising even more questions. Alice, Sweet Alice is an extremely unsettling but well-made psychological horror film, and the film's big highlight is most definitely this translucent mask that the killer wears, which is absolutely disturbing even though it was quite a common Halloween mask in the 50s and early 60s, and especially for children. By far the most famous relic of the film, the mask could have very well carried the film into becoming a well-known film in the horror genre, which begs the question, why isn't this film more remembered today? Especially since it is sandwiched between the release dates of both the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Halloween. I feel there are two big reasons for this. First, and most obviously, Alice, Sweet Alice, or Holy Terror, or even Communion, does not have any sequels. Unlike other slasher films, whether it be a Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, Scream, Child's Play, and a slew of others, Alice, Sweet Alice is simply a one-off, a self-contained film that saw no need for a sequel to even be made. Most of the time, though not always, the most remembered horror films, slasher movies or otherwise, are those with sequels, since the more sequels are made, the more people are aware of a movie's existence. For example, a person watching Friday the 13th Part 4, the final chapter, without watching the first 3 Friday the 13th films would look at the title and immediately think of the first 3 films, then likely prompting them to watch those 3 films as a result, assuming they liked Part 4. Even films such as The Hills Have Eyes from 1977 would see a sequel be made, with sequels almost expected for most horror movies. For Alice, Sweet Alice, though, It is welcoming news that the film never generated a sequel, as it simply didn't need to. The film is simply powerful and haunting as it is, without the need for any sort of continuation of the story. Which leads to the second possible reason as to why the film is not as remembered today as some of its contemporaries. And the most important reason: the film was simply too heavy, controversial, and uncomfortable because of the themes and topics that it comments on. As a whole, Alice, Sweet Alice is about a neglected child who always gets the short end of the stick by all those around her, and especially from her mother, who antagonizes Alice and shows obvious favoritism towards Karen. Yet the reason for this is quite dark. Alice, unlike the more loved Karen, was an unplanned child who Catherine gave birth to outside of wedlock, an act that Catherine would fall into an enormous amount of personal guilt for, with Catherine only marrying her ex-husband because of Alice's birth. The consequences of this are far-reaching, with the guilt causing Catherine to lash out at Alice while always letting Karen off the hook. And the guilt also likely plays a role in Catherine constantly taking her sister's side over Alice's side, something which disturbs and saddens Alice. Interestingly though, when Catherine notices that the authorities and her sister, Annie, are convinced that Alice was behind both Karen's murder and the horrific knife attack against Annie on the stairwell, Catherine jumps in to defend Alice against the allegations, lashing out against everyone else instead for even implying Alice had anything to do with the horrors. Still, in Alice's case, the damage caused by her mother's guilt was already done, as Alice prefers to isolate herself in abandoned buildings, hiding away from the outside world, and also just wants to be alone, wearing masks as she wanders aimlessly. This social isolation only makes her a bigger target for the community she wants to distance herself from, even giving intense looks of wonder at religious images and statues, as if to suggest she is looking for answers and clarity herself, opening herself up to anything that would provide what she is looking for, which seems to be peace, or at least a sense of peace. Other than child neglect, the film also paints a gritty and realistic picture of the breakdown of the nuclear family unit, as Alice's parents are divorced, and while no explanation behind the divorce is given, one can assume infidelity likely played a role, given the ex-husband, Dominic, already has a partner while Catherine is single. It could also be assumed that both Alice and Karen have not lived with their father in their household for a considerable amount of time, as throughout the film, we see Catherine constantly reminding him of his new wife and that he should go back home to her, suggesting that it may have been years since Karen and Alice lived with their father. This breakdown of their family unit, caused by fatherly absence, is undoubtedly a contributing factor in the breakdown of friendly relations between the two sisters, and between Alice and her mother in general, as her mother still cannot help seeing Alice through the lens of having her out of wedlock, creating a dysfunctional and broken family unit, perhaps not as disturbing as the one seen in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but arguably more realistic and upsetting to watch. Still, while these reasons may have prevented the film from gaining more notoriety, it is still an extremely well-crafted work of horror cinema, such as when Catherine stares out a store window as it is raining, or when Karen's post-mortem pictures are given to a woman working in forensics, are simply wonderful, and are amazing examples of just how well done the cinematography can be on an independent film production, although the cinematography history of the film is chaotic, as according to director Alfred Soule mentions on the DVD and Blu-ray film commentary that there was a total of 9 cinematographers that worked on the film, with the cinematographers constantly dropping their involvement because of the film's relatively low budget, and Soule's inability to pay the cinematographers at times. The fact that so many cinematographers worked on this one movie only further adds a creepier and more raw edge to it, as we are effectively seeing different styles from different cinematographers all unfolding on the screen at once, creating a disorienting and odd effect for the viewer. Notably, over the years, the film has also been called an example of American giallo. Giallo, or yellow in Italian, is an Italian style of horror films that relies on stark, vibrant colors and stylized murders and plots that typically involve crimes, the supernatural, and murder mysteries. To this end, Alice, Sweet Alice falls into this category, as while it does not involve the supernatural, it is most definitely a cunning murder mystery, ripe with a dark sense of style, with the key star color in the film's color palette ironically being yellow, especially the yellow raincoats that Alice and Karen wear, the same raincoat that Alice wears consistently throughout the film. These elements make the film similar to those directed by Italian horror master Dario Argento, who would often rely on making stark colors focal points for his horror films, with the most commonly used being red, in such Argento masterpieces as Deep Red from 1975, and easily his most famous film, Suspiria. As one of the very first slasher films ever made, one neat tidbit is the fact that Alice Sweet Alice also pays very big homage to Hitchcock's Psycho, the film that most historians point to as the first major film with slasher elements, with the film even featuring the actual original poster to the movie, which makes sense given the film takes place just a year after Psycho was released. When it comes to the rest of the characters in the film, easily the most notorious is the landlord, Mr. Alfonso, portrayed by Alfred de Nobel, a gluttonous, perverted, and downright unsettling character who adds more unease and discomfort to the overall film, with such a freakish and offbeat performance that makes the audience downright hate him, even making suggestive comments to Alice. However, like the many circumstances surrounding Catherine and Dominic's marriage, the breakdown of the family unit, and completely taking religious texts out of context and using them to justify evil, Mr. Alfonso is yet another example of the horror caused by immorality and decadence, as he can easily be representative of many of the 7 deadly sins. For much of the day, he sleeps and is at rest, preferring to live a lethargic life rather than an active one, representing the sin of sloth. For gluttony, he constantly indulges, even being given a cake as a gift from Catherine early in the film. For lust, he makes extremely disturbing advances towards Alice, which adds to the already strained relationship Alice has with society and everyone in it. And greed, given the fact that he constantly collects money and values material goods and money over anything else, not to mention being their landlord. My favorite character in the film by far is Father Tom, the total opposite of Mr. Alfonso, played by the incredible Rudolph Willrich. He just seems to be fed up with the decadence and hatred all around him, that even comes from his housekeeper, Miss Tredoni, and it seems he is the only one at least trying to push morality to people on paths of self-destruction and uneasiness, even doing his best to take part in the quest to track down the killer behind Karen and the other victims. A beacon of light in a world of blatant immorality. Another key factor that makes the film work so well is the setting of the city of Paterson, New Jersey. As a New Jerseyan who's been to Paterson many times throughout my life, I can safely say that Paterson is an ideal setting for a story of this type. Paterson just has a raw look and feel to it, especially as it used to be such an important industrial city in the early 20th century, but has since fallen in industrial might and significance, with many jobs, factories, and companies leaving the city en masse over the course of the 20th century, which explains the abandoned building locations used in the film. The city just works, and the industrial architecture of the film give it a unique urban Gothic feel, similar to 1992's Candyman with its own abandoned locations. Paterson also has this film to claim as its own in the same way that Blairstown, New Jersey claims the original Friday the 13th, and the Pine Barrens of southern New Jersey can lay claim to 1998's The Last Broadcast, a historic found-footage horror film that predated the release of the Blair Witch Project by a year, despite Blair Witch entering production first. In terms of the cast of the 3 main characters introduced right at the beginning of the film, the mother, Catherine, is portrayed by Linda Miller, who also happens to be the daughter of 1950s music and television legend Jackie Gleason. Karen was famously played by Brooke Shields in Shields' very first movie role. Yes, before Pretty Baby, Sahara, and even guest starring in an episode of Impractical Jokers, Brooke Shields began her career by getting killed off at the beginning of Alice Sweet Alice. What a journey. To me, the unsung acting talent in the film is that of Paula Sheppard, as Alice, who was actually 19 at the time of filming. Despite only appearing in one other film after this, Sheppard does a phenomenal job as Alice, as she conveys Alice's pain, trauma, and isolation very effectively, playing the character incredibly well, combining fiery frustration and the throwing of insults with deep, lingering sadness and loneliness. Quite possibly one of the best depictions of female adolescence and its complexities in horror movie history. All in all, Alice Sweet Alice is a hidden gem in the universe of horror cinema, and is very deserving of rediscovery. But the horrors in the film are much more than the gruesome and unapologetic murders that happen on screen. The true horror of the film is a realm showing the audience what just might happen if one chooses immorality rather than morality. The murders that happen in the film are directly tied to the mistakes made by Alice's parents, and the sins they continually pay for, either inside of themselves in the form of guilt, or simply the destructive, family-breaking actions that were made that led to the strained relationship between Alice and her sister Karen, which played a role in wrecking Alice's life, ultimately having her pay for the wrongs that her parents had done. The boiling anger and frustration inside different characters also lead to different tragedies in the film, whether it be frustration that leads to quickly pinning the murders on Alice, or the murders happening themselves, even in a church setting. The moral horror of Alice, Sweet Alice is simply the horror of the consequences caused by immorality and immoral actions. How if such immorality were totally avoided, none of the dysfunction would have entered the picture. And it also warns of just how important it is to consider virtue and wisdom in every situation, and with every choice that we make, controlling our emotions and impulses, as otherwise, destruction is inevitable, even if the next generation pays for it. With almost 50 years of haunting viewers since its release, one thing is for sure. Alice, Sweet Alice is a film that was made to make you feel uncomfortable, and it succeeds.